"I did not steal anything. Check the cameras." Her words thundered through the mall as guards forced a black woman into a chair. No one listened. No evidence, no questions, only prejudice and humiliation in front of strangers who looked on in silence. But this was not the end. What came next was a fight for dignity, a lesson in courage, and the truth that would expose every lie. Sometimes, those judged the harshest become the ones who change everything. So tell me, how would you feel if it were you in that chair? Share your thoughts in the comments, and wherever you are, may your day be filled with strength and hope. Saturday morning unfolded over Brookhaven with pale sunlight slipping through thinning clouds, the kind of weather that made the glass walls of the mall gleam like a promise. The streets had already begun to stir with weekend errands, families piling into minivans, teenagers planning to linger around food courts, and older couples content to walk slow laps under skylights that pretended to be a gentler sky. After all that had come before, Clara Johnson rose early, buttoned her long gray coat, and carried in her bag a folded list of items she intended to buy. Her destination was Brookhaven Mall, and her purpose, as it had always been, was simple but full of meaning: to keep a promise to her students. At 60, Clara carried herself with the calm dignity of someone who had weathered storms and still kept her eyes clear. Her hair was cropped close, touched with silver, her dark skin glowing faintly in the autumn light, her scarf wrapped neat and practical around her neck. She was not at the mall for luxury, nor to browse aimlessly. She was there to purchase electronic components for the solar energy project she had been building with the children in her volunteer class. Every week they gathered in the basement of the neighborhood church, and she taught them how wires carried current, how light could be captured and transformed, how science was not just equations on a page, but power that could illuminate their world. The electronics store sat between a sleek boutique selling shoes at impossible prices and a homeware showroom lit like a gallery. Clara stepped inside, and the bells chimed brightly above her. The air smelled of polished wood and new packaging, while rows of devices gleamed under cold, white lights. Behind the counter stood Greg Wilson, a man in his late 40s with a stiff navy blazer straining at the seams, thinning hair slicked back too carefully, and a smile that seemed more rehearsed than genuine. He noticed her, offered a quick greeting, and glanced at the handwritten list she placed neatly on the counter. She explained what she needed: solar cells, a small inverter, connectors, and a few tools to support the children's project. And his brows lifted slightly, as if already measuring the inconvenience of fetching items not displayed on the shelves. While Greg disappeared into the back room, the bell chimed again and another figure entered. She was in her late 30s, with glossy blonde hair, a tailored coat of winter white, and heels that tapped against the tiles like impatient punctuation. Madison Hale looked every bit the picture of wealth diamond studs in her ears, a phone case gleaming with metallic trim, a handbag that could have covered rent for a month. She moved through the store as though the aisles were arranged for her alone, setting her phone on one display table, testing a case, moving to the next. A few moments later, her voice rose, sharp enough to slice the hum of background music. "My phone is gone," she declared, lifting her handbag and shaking its contents with a theatrical urgency. Her eyes swept across the room, quick and decisive, and landed on Clara, who stood patiently by the counter. "It was right here a moment ago, and she's the only one who's been standing near." The words, loud and commanding, fell with the weight of an accusation already believed. Clara looked back with quiet steadiness, but around her the atmosphere shifted. The teenage clerk stiffened, Greg returned from the stockroom with boxes in hand and froze, and the silence that followed seemed to frame her as if she had stepped into someone else's script. Greg placed the boxes on the counter and turned toward Madison, his professional concern arranged like a mask. "We'll handle this, ma'am," he said, the kind of assurance that implied the outcome before any evidence had been checked. He glanced at Clara, not harshly but with a kind of weary certainty, as if he had already chosen the more comfortable path of siding with the louder customer. He did not ask Madison to search her handbag again, nor suggest that they check the security cameras mounted discreetly near the ceiling. Instead, he radioed mall security, his tone clipped and brisk, and within minutes, 2 guards arrived at the doorway. The older guard, broad-shouldered with a square jaw and the kind of posture that announces authority, looked at Clara as though she had already failed some test. His partner, younger and less certain, hung back with his hands tucked close, eyes darting between the women. "Ma'am," the older one said, "we'll need you to come with us to the security office." Clara raised her chin slightly, keeping her voice calm. She explained she was here for parts for her student's project and asked them, politely but firmly, to check the camera footage. "There's been a mistake," she said, holding her folded list in one hand. But the guards ignored her request, the older one placing a hand near her arm, steering her toward the back corridor with the practiced efficiency of a man who seldom doubts his own orders. The security office was small and windowless, its carpet stained and its fluorescent lights humming. A desk with a computer monitor occupied the center, and a wall of screens flickered with live feeds from across the mall. Clara sat in a chair with a thin cushion while the guards emptied her canvas bag onto the table. A worn wallet, a screwdriver kit wrapped in cloth, a paperback novel bent from use, an envelope with carefully counted bills set aside for the purchases she had planned. Each item was laid out in a line, none resembling the phone Madison claimed was missing. Clara asked again that they review the cameras. Her tone was firm, but not pleading, each syllable clipped with the discipline of someone who has spent years teaching children that truth, like light, is steady. Greg stood near the door, arms folded, his face pinched with a mixture of irritation and relief that the responsibility no longer rested squarely on him. Madison remained standing with arms crossed, glancing at the wall clock with impatient sighs, as if her inconvenience were the greater crime. The younger guard shifted from foot to foot, uneasy, while the older leaned against the desk with the certainty of someone who expected the conclusion before the investigation. Into this atmosphere came Officer James Reeves, his polished uniform crisp, his boots shining, his jaw set in a permanent frown. Reeves was in his mid-40s, compact and composed, the kind of man whose every gesture carried the suggestion that he had already seen too much and trusted too little. He listened first to Madison's account, nodding gravely, then to Greg's supportive version of events. When Clara spoke, laying out her list, her purchases, her students waiting for her return, and her repeated plea to check the cameras, he made a note but did not turn to the monitors. He asked why she carried so much cash, questioned her again about the missing phone, and ignored the fact that her belongings contained nothing resembling it. He never once asked Madison to open her bag fully, though its shape clearly suggested space enough to hold the device. Clara, sensing the injustice settling thick in the air, took a steady breath and repeated, "Please review the footage. It will show the truth." Reeves looked at her evenly, then said the decision would be to detain her until things could be sorted out. The words fell with finality, and the guards moved to collect her items and return them to her bag. Clara did not resist. She folded her hands in her lap, calm and deliberate, as if teaching by example even now. They led her through the service corridor, fluorescent lights buzzing above, the air stale with cardboard and dust. Outside, the mall continued its performance of normalcy, music loops playing, shoppers carrying bags without knowledge of the small injustice unfolding behind the scenes. At the precinct, Reeves filed his paperwork, clipped it into a thin folder, and informed Clara that she would be held overnight for review. It was the neat conclusion of a chain of assumptions that began with a voice raised in accusation and ended with a woman spending the night in custody for a crime she had not committed. The door closed behind her with a soft final click, and Clara sat with her back straight, eyes clear, breathing measured. She carried herself as she always had, steady, unbroken, unwilling to give fear more room than it deserved. Somewhere in Brookhaven, children would wait for her lesson on sunlight and energy, not knowing that their teacher was learning a harsher lesson about prejudice and patience. And beyond the closed door, the mall's cameras still recorded silently, holding the truth that no one had bothered to check. Night settled over the precinct with the chill of late autumn seeping through concrete walls, and the quiet buzz of fluorescent lights casting pale shadows across the holding cells. The door had closed behind Clara with its dull, metallic click, and she now sat alone on a bench too narrow to hold her comfort, her back straight despite the fatigue tugging at her shoulders. Her arm throbbed where the guard had shoved her earlier, the ache running deep into the muscle, a reminder that force often falls hardest on those least prepared for it. The air smelled faintly of bleach and damp fabric, the kind of institutional odor that erases individuality, and yet Clara held herself like someone determined not to vanish into the grayness. The hours crawled slowly, each tick of the wall clock louder than the last, and in the silence, Clara's thoughts spiraled backward across the decades she had lived with quiet dignity. She remembered the orphanage where she had first chosen to serve, not because anyone demanded it, but because she saw hungry eyes in children who had lost too much too soon. She remembered countless evenings spent teaching letters and numbers, stitching torn clothes, pressing coins into small hands so they could buy lunch the next day. For every face that had brightened at her kindness, there were others who looked past her skin and saw only what prejudice told them to see. And now, as an old woman confined without cause, the sting of those years pressed close. She folded her hands in her lap and breathed slowly, refusing to give the cameras or the guards the spectacle of anger. Instead, she thought of the children waiting in the church basement, their science project half finished, their excitement deferred another week. The lesson she had always preached, patience, dignity, perseverance, was being tested in ways none of them could imagine. How cruel, she thought, that a life lived with steady kindness could still be smeared by a single unfounded claim in a store filled with strangers. Yet even in her pain, she clung to the conviction that truth, however delayed, would arrive. Beyond the walls of the precinct, news traveled faster than the officers realized. A clerk who had witnessed the commotion in the mall whispered to a friend who posted a few lines online. Elderly woman arrested at Brookhaven, mall accused of stealing a phone. The words were vague, but sharp, stripped of context, and carried on the current of curiosity. By evening, community forums buzzed with speculation, some voices rushing to condemn, others to question. The incident became not just a moment of misunderstanding, but a story reshaped by every mouth that told it, and with each telling, Clara's quiet dignity was tested again. In a modest apartment across town, Marcus Hayes scrolled through his phone after a long day at the legal aid office where he worked. He was 28, tall and lean with tightly curled black hair cropped neat, a crisp white shirt rolled at the sleeves, and glasses that slid down his nose when he leaned too close to the screen. Marcus had chosen law not for wealth but for justice. His heart beat strongest for those with little voice, because he knew what it meant to grow up voiceless himself. When the headline appeared on his feed, he froze, his mind snagging not on the accusation but on the description. An older black woman detained at Brookhaven Mall. Something in his chest tightened, and he scrolled further, his eyes narrowing as details emerged. The name came in a second post, brief and almost careless: Clara Johnson. Marcus set his phone down with shaking hands, memory surging like a tide he could not hold back. He was 9 years old again, a thin boy with scuffed sneakers and an empty stomach, wandering too close to despair, until Clara Johnson had taken him in after his mother's passing. She had given him meals, books, stern lectures when he strayed, and more love than he believed the world still held. Her guidance had carried him from the cracked sidewalks of his youth to the university lecture halls where he discovered his voice. Now, reading that the woman who had saved him sat in a cell branded a thief, Marcus felt anger burn through his veins. Without hesitation, he pulled on his navy coat and stuffed papers into a worn leather satchel. His apartment was modest, filled with second-hand furniture and shelves sagging under law books, but his purpose outgrew the walls in that instant. He locked the door behind him, striding into the cold night with a determination carved by years of gratitude. The streets shimmered under lamplight, the air sharp in his lungs, and each step carried him closer to the precinct where Clara waited. He rehearsed the arguments he would make, the laws he would cite, the authority he would wield not for himself but for her, the woman who had never asked for anything in return. Inside the precinct, a young officer passed Clara's cell with indifferent eyes, tapping at his clipboard as if she were only a name on a form. She did not speak to him, though her silence was not resignation but quiet defiance. She sat upright, hands folded, the pain in her arm throbbing but not breaking her resolve. Her dignity, she thought, was the one possession they could not confiscate. Through the bars, she glimpsed the faint glow of a television in the waiting area, where the evening news had begun to mention her case, the anchor's polished voice treating her life like another headline to fill airtime. Back on the street, Marcus reached the precinct, his breath visible in the night air, his heart pounding not from the distance, but from urgency. He pushed through the doors, his frame straightened by purpose, his eyes scanning until they found the desk sergeant. "My name is Marcus Hayes," he said firmly, presenting his bar card with a steady hand. "And I'm here to see my client, Clara Johnson." The words landed with authority, but underneath them pulsed the quiet truth. He was here for the woman who had once been his only family. The sergeant, startled by his conviction, hesitated before nodding, the weight of officialdom momentarily slowed by the determination of a man who owed everything to the one behind those walls. And so, as the night deepened and the hum of fluorescent lights carried through the corridors, Clara's isolation was no longer absolute. Help was coming, drawn not by chance, but by the long echo of kindness she had sown years before. The bruises on her arm, the ache in her spirit, the injustice of her confinement. All of it would soon meet the force of loyalty reborn in Marcus Hayes, the boy she had raised into a man who now carried the law in his hands. The precinct hummed with its late-night rhythm, a blend of paperwork, muted radios, and the steady drone of fluorescent lights. Clara sat behind the cold bars of the holding cell, her posture dignified though her arms still ached, her silence a shield against the indignity pressing close. In the corridor beyond, Marcus Hayes walked with firm, measured steps, his leather satchel swinging at his side, his breath steady though his heart beat like a drum against his ribs. He had declared his purpose at the desk, and now the young attorney carried not only the weight of the law, but the promise of gratitude stretching back to a boyhood, saved by the woman now unjustly confined. Marcus requested to see the watch commander, a man in his early 50s named Captain Reynolds, whose uniform fit snug over a frame softened by years behind desks. Reynolds had a heavy brow, thinning hair, and a practiced air of mild irritation, but his voice retained authority. Marcus presented his bar card again, then explained with professional calm that he wished to file a formal request to review the mall's security footage. "There is exculpatory evidence," he said firmly, "and the law requires its preservation." Reynolds hesitated, weighing the inconvenience against the formality in Marcus's tone, then nodded curtly and directed him to the evidence clerk's office down the hall. The evidence clerk, a young woman with sharp eyes behind round glasses, led Marcus into a narrow room lined with shelves of DVDs and hard drives. Her badge read L. Torres, her uniform neat, but her expression weary, as if she had seen too many cases handled carelessly. She set the hard drive labeled Brookhaven Mall November 14th on the counter, plugged it into the precinct's monitor, and motioned for Marcus to watch. The screen flickered, and grainy footage filled the room. Shoppers drifting past displays, children pulling at parents' hands. The normal bustle of a Saturday afternoon framed in silent black and white. Marcus leaned closer, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning every detail. The footage shifted angles, showing the electronics boutique. There was Clara, steady and precise, her coat neat, her list in hand as she spoke to the clerk. Then came Madison Hale, coat swinging, hair glinting, her phone in hand as she tested a display case. The camera caught it clearly. She set the phone down, then absent-mindedly dropped it into her own handbag while fussing with another accessory. Moments later, she spun, eyes wide, declaring it gone, her performance pitched for effect. The timeline was undeniable. The phone had never left her possession. Marcus exhaled slowly, his hand curling into a fist against the table. "There it is," he said under his breath, his voice taut with vindication. Torres glanced at him, her lips pressing into a line, and muttered, "Doesn't look like your lady stole anything." "Looks like she's the one being set up." Marcus nodded, already gathering his thoughts for the fight ahead. He copied the relevant segment, time-stamped and sealed under protocol, onto a disk he could enter into evidence. He signed the chain of custody form with a flourish, the law on his side, and asked that the original be secured against tampering. Torres assured him it would be done, her tone edged with sympathy that rarely surfaced in her work. Carrying the disc like a shield, Marcus returned to the holding cells. The corridor seemed narrower, the bars harsher, yet when he saw Clara sitting on the bench, hands folded in her lap, a sense of calm steadied him. He stepped close, his face framed by the iron bars, his eyes soft, though his voice caught with emotion. For a moment, the years folded back. The hungry child she had fed, the trembling boy she had comforted, the restless teenager she had guided into discipline and hope. Now he stood tall, a man with law on his side, ready to return the grace she had once given him. Clara lifted her head, her gaze meeting his with a mixture of surprise and recognition. The lines of weariness on her face softened, replaced by the warmth of trust she had always extended to him. "Marcus?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying both wonder and relief. He gripped the bar with one hand, the disc in the other, his throat tightening as memory and present fused into a single truth. "Years ago," he said, voice thick but steady, "you saved me when no one else would. You gave me food, shelter, and hope. Tonight, it's my turn. Tonight, I'll protect you." Her eyes glistened, but she did not let the tears fall. Clara was too proud for that. Instead, she gave a slow nod, the smallest smile touching her lips, a smile of quiet triumph that even the steel bars could not erase. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken history, a bond forged in survival and kindness, now tested in the harsh light of injustice. Marcus held her gaze, then raised the disc slightly, a promise that truth was no longer hidden. Beyond them, the precinct's fluorescent hum seemed to fade, leaving only the certainty that the past had circled back to repay its debt. The captain passed by, glancing at them briefly, unaware that the balance of the night had shifted. The guards walked their rounds, indifferent, but in the small space between one woman's endurance and one man's gratitude, a battle had already been won. The footage would speak louder than any accusation, and Marcus's words spoken with the weight of a lifetime would stand as proof that kindness, though often dismissed, has a way of returning when it is needed most. Morning light filtered through the narrow windows of the precinct, turning the gray walls a paler shade but doing little to lift the weight in the air. Clara remained seated in her cell, calm and composed, while Marcus stood beside Captain Reynolds in the evidence room with the disc queued up once more. The atmosphere was charged, officers passing by with glances that betrayed curiosity and unease. Something about this case felt different, because truth once revealed carries a gravity that cannot be ignored. The screen flickered, showing the boutique again, and Madison Hale's performance replayed for the room. Her manicured fingers tossed her handbag open, her lips forming the dramatic words about her missing phone. But then came the undeniable moment. She slipped the device inside her bag, glanced around with calculated impatience, and moments later cried out that it was gone. The footage rolled twice, slow enough for even the most skeptical eye to see. There was no ambiguity, no shadow to hide in. Madison had accused Clara falsely, and the evidence was now beyond dispute. A hush fell over the room. Madison herself stood off to the side, brought in after Marcus's insistence that she be present. Her cheeks burned crimson under her flawless makeup, her hands clutching the expensive handbag like a child holding a guilty secret. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet Clara's steady eyes through the glass partition, and for the first time her voice failed her. The arrogance that had carried her accusations dissolved, leaving only shame thick in the air. Greg Wilson, the manager who had so quickly sided with her, shifted uneasily on his feet. His blazer now seemed too tight, his polished shoes scuffing against the linoleum as if searching for escape. He cleared his throat, but found no words to justify his haste. His authority shrunk under the weight of evidence. The guards who had restrained Clara looked away, the younger biting his lip in visible regret, the older stiff with discomfort. In the corner, the hum of the machine replaying the footage was the only sound that dared fill the silence. Officer James Reeves stood still, his face carved with a tension he could not mask. The veteran officer, once so certain in his judgment, now looked small in the face of failure. His hand brushed against the folder he had prepared to justify Clara's overnight detention, the words inside now hollow. He knew the precinct's internal affairs unit would demand answers, that his career might hang in the balance. He tried to compose himself, adjusting his belt, but his eyes betrayed the flicker of fear. The room seemed to close in around him, each tick of the clock reminding him of the consequences of arrogance unchecked. Marcus did not gloat, though his chest swelled with relief. Instead, he stood firm, voice measured, reminding the officers of what they had overlooked. "The cameras were here all along," he said, his tone professional but laced with restrained anger. "A woman's dignity was put on trial without evidence, while the truth sat waiting in plain sight. What does that say about how quickly we judge, and how slowly we correct?" His words were not shouted, but they cut deeper for their calm clarity, leaving the room unsettled. They brought Clara from her cell, her steps steady, her coat still draped neatly despite the long night. She didn't rush, did not falter, and when she reached the room, she glanced at the monitor only once, her face betraying no surprise. She had known all along where the truth resided. Standing before the officers, her presence filled the silence more powerfully than accusation ever could. Even Madison's trembling apology never left her lips, for Clara's calm gaze made words unnecessary. Clara's voice broke the silence, low and even, carrying the weight of 60 years lived with resilience. "I do not need an apology for myself," she said, her tone neither bitter nor forgiving, but resolute. "What I want is justice for every person who has stood where I stand now, judged unfairly, silenced by assumption, humiliated without cause. If my pain is to mean anything, let it be a lesson that dignity is not to be gambled with, and truth must be sought before judgment is cast." Her words rang out like scripture, settling into every ear in the room. Reeves lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze, his voice caught in his throat. Greg fumbled with his hands, muttering something about procedures, but no one listened. Madison pressed her lips together, a shallow nod her only admission. The guards stood stiff, their silence heavier than words. In that moment, Clara, once accused and confined, now stood freer than all of them, her calm strength a mirror reflecting their failures. The precinct, for all its hum and bustle, felt still as her words lingered. Marcus looked at her with quiet pride, remembering every kindness she had shown him, every lesson she had offered. The officers shuffled papers and adjusted belts, but the truth had already been spoken, and nothing would ever erase it. Clara Johnson, 60 years old, had stood against prejudice not by force but by unwavering dignity. The night of injustice had ended, and the dawn had revealed both guilt and grace. The courthouse rose from the center of Brookhaven like a monument to judgment, its stone columns gray against a pale sky, its steps crowded with reporters, townspeople, and quiet onlookers waiting to witness what justice would finally declare. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, every shuffle of papers or scrape of shoes echoing in the chamber where Clara Johnson sat calmly with Marcus Hayes at her side. The weeks of waiting had culminated in this single morning, and though she carried no bitterness on her face, the deep lines at the corners of her eyes told the story of sleepless nights and a dignity tested beyond measure. Judge Elena Morton, a woman in her early 60s with sharp cheekbones, steel-gray hair pulled into a bun, and glasses perched low on her nose, presided with the authority of someone who had spent decades on the bench. Her robe flowed like ink as she lifted the gavel, her voice carrying through the chamber with clarity. "This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the conduct of all parties involved in the matter of Clara Johnson," she announced, each word landing with weight. "And today, justice will be spoken plainly." First came Madison Hale, seated in the front row with her diamond earrings muted by shame. She had traded her glamorous coat for a modest gray dress, her posture shrunken, her once bright eyes cast downward. The judge's voice cut the silence. "For knowingly making a false accusation, you are sentenced to 200 hours of community service, and you will provide financial restitution to Ms. Johnson for damages suffered." Madison flinched but did not argue. The footage had left no room for denial. Her cheeks burned as the gallery murmured, the image of wealth and entitlement now replaced with that of accountability. Next was Greg Wilson, the store manager, who shifted nervously at the defendant's table, his blazer wrinkled, his hair limp with sweat. Judge Morton regarded him coolly. "As manager, you acted without investigation, relying on assumption rather than evidence. This negligence has consequences. You are terminated from your position effective immediately, and your conduct will be reported to relevant licensing bodies for review." Greg swallowed hard, his lips parting as if to protest, but the judge's gaze silenced him. His career had unraveled as swiftly as his misplaced trust. Then came Officer James Reeves, standing stiffly in uniform, though the sheen of his badge seemed duller under the weight of scrutiny. Judge Morton's tone grew sharper. "You failed to uphold the very principles you swore to protect. You ignored evidence, dismissed due process, and caused physical and emotional harm to an innocent woman. Effective today, you are suspended without pay, pending an internal investigation for disciplinary action and potential civil rights violations." Reeves's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the gallery where fellow officers sat in uneasy silence. For the first time in decades of service, his authority no longer protected him. The room shifted when the corporate representatives of Brookhaven Mall were called forward. Two executives in dark suits sat stiff, their polished shoes gleaming but their faces pale. The judge's words cut through their composure. This court orders Brookhaven Mall to issue a public apology to Ms. Johnson and the community. Furthermore, new security policies will be implemented immediately. No detention shall be carried out without clear evidence, and all accusations must be supported by security footage before escalation. You will fund these reforms and ensure compliance for 5 years under court supervision. The executives nodded hastily, pens scratching on notepads as though action could erase culpability. Clara listened, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her dark eyes steady as the gavel's rhythm brought closure to each verdict. When the court addressed her directly, she rose, her posture straight though her frame carried the weariness of long endurance. The judge confirmed the compensation, due monetary damages meant to restore what had been taken. Clara inclined her head in acknowledgement, though her expression revealed little interest in personal gain. For her, the true reward was the precedent set, the shift in policy that would spare others from the humiliation she endured. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, cameras flashing as Clara emerged with Marcus at her side. Questions flew about how she felt, whether she forgave, what she planned to do with the settlement. Clara paused at the top of the steps, the wind tugging at her scarf, and spoke with the clarity of someone who measured words carefully. "I will use what has been given not to enrich myself, but to enrich the children who still believe in fairness and in knowledge. Books and science tools will be purchased for my volunteer class. They are the future, and they will learn that dignity cannot be stolen." The crowd hushed, then erupted in applause, her quiet resolve piercing louder than any shouted claim. Weeks later, a community gathering filled the church hall where Clara taught, the long tables now stacked with new microscopes, solar kits, and shelves of books gleaming with possibility. Children ran with excitement, their laughter spilling through the room as neighbors and elders assembled to celebrate. Clara moved through the crowd, greeting each face with gentle nods, her presence a living testament to resilience. The air buzzed with pride, not only in her vindication, but in the way she had turned her pain into a gift for others. At the podium stood Marcus, his voice carrying strong yet tender, the cadence of both attorney and grateful son. He looked at Clara, his eyes moist but unflinching, and said, "Years ago, her kindness saved me when I had nothing. Today, that same kindness has saved more than one life. It has saved a generation's faith in justice. Clara Johnson is proof that goodness, though tested, does not vanish. It multiplies." His words drew a standing ovation, the hall trembling with applause, and Clara, though modest, allowed herself a small smile, her heart swelling with quiet pride. As the evening drew to a close, Clara sat among her students, their eager hands turning the pages of new books, their voices full of questions about science and the future. She watched them with a warmth that outshone the hardships behind her, knowing that the true measure of justice was not in punishments delivered, but in hope restored. In their bright faces she saw the seed of something greater than herself, and she whispered a prayer of gratitude that the trials she endured had given birth to this moment. The story of Clara Johnson leaves us with lessons that reach far beyond one courtroom and one community. It reminds us that overcoming social prejudice requires not only patience, but also the courage to stand firm when the world insists on misunderstanding us. It shows that kindness, even when unnoticed in the moment, is never wasted, because the seeds of goodness planted today will bloom into justice tomorrow. And it proves that true heroes are often silent, living humbly among us, until the moment comes when their light cannot be ignored. What do you think about Clara's journey? Do you believe that dignity and compassion can truly change the way society treats its most vulnerable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in stories that inspire change. And may God bless each of you for choosing to stand with truth and kindness.